Hello again. I have been reading the newspapers this morning and watching the news, and I can honestly say that I am slightly sickened by the sheer hypocrisy of what is being said about the Russian actions in Ukraine. One might think that the nation responsible for the horrors of Dresden and Hamburg during the Second World War would not wish to talk too much about civilian deaths and collateral damage during bombing raids, but I suppose that it might be argued that this was almost 80 years ago. Britain has changed since then and now realises that such behaviour in wartime is barbaric and wrong. Seriously. Have viewers honestly forgotten that the RAF was dropping cluster bombs in civilian areas of Europe as recently as 1999? Do they really not remember that columns of refugees were being bombed by NATO that same year, also in Europe? When they worry about radiation from Russian attacks on Ukrainian power stations, do they really not know about NATO's use of depleted uranium munitions in 1999 in Europe? Have they forgotten that NATO bombed a hospital in Europe that same year? It seems not, because the bombing of the hospital in Mariupol is in today's newspaper headlines in this country being described as depraved. In the description to this video, I give a link to an article from the Guardian newspaper from the year 2000. Not all that long ago, really. Let me read out one or two bits from it. The RAF continued to drop cluster bombs during the Kosovo War after Washington had ordered US pilots to stop using them. Perfectly true, no doubt about that. The RAF dropped more than 500 cluster bombs during the 78-day war. Yes, quite true. Does anybody now remember a few days ago when there was speculation that Russia might use cluster bombs in Ukraine, and what a wicked thing that would be to do? Breathtaking hypocrisy and double standards. Many civilians were killed by these weapons in 1999, and I quote, officials at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague conducted an internal appraisal of the case against NATO in December. Does anybody remember that? Britain's defence against the charges of civilian deaths was that the Yugoslavs had been using civilians as human shields. In other words, the deaths from the bombings were not the RAF's fault at all, but were down to the Yugoslav government. Here's a good bit. Several of the worst incidents involved civilian casualties resulting from the bombing of refugee convoys. Tell me, am I honestly the only person in Britain who remembers that the RAF and NATO bombed columns of refugees in Europe 23 years ago? I can't think that this can really be true. Also in the description to this video, I give a link to a Wikipedia article on the NATO bombings of Yugoslavia. Let's have a look at some of them. On April the 14th, during daylight hours, NATO aircraft repeatedly bombed Albanian refugee movements over a 12-mile stretch of road, killing 73 civilians and injuring 36 others. Please, nobody tell me about the Russian bombing of refugees in Ukraine. These things happen in wartime. What about this? At approximately 12:50 a.m. local time on May the 19th, 1999, the University Hospital Centre of Dragica Mizovic in Belgrade was destroyed by NATO laser-guided bombs. 3 patients were killed. Was that as depraved as the Russian bombing of a hospital recently? NATO and the RAF were doing just as many dreadful things in Europe in 1999 as Russia is today. Viewers might like to stop and ask themselves how these actions differ in any way at all. All wars are terrible, and it is in the nature of war that people are killed, civilians and soldiers both. Perhaps if the RAF and NATO had not been quite so keen on bombing Slavs in 1999, the Russians might not have felt so threatened and encircled as they do today. I don't think that NATO bombing Belgrade and signing up countries like Estonia to their military alliance was a brilliant scheme. Not if you are keen on world peace, that is.